Sebastian Garcia is a graduate student just finishing up his master's degree at my alma mater, the University of Central Florida. Go Knights. When I met Sebastian 4 years ago, he was an undergraduate student, and he had a podcast called Knights History Cast that he hosted me for. I'm going to put that link in the show notes. Y'all, seriously, if you want to hear my enjoyment at peak enjoyment releasing Play All Night, it was me talking with him. It was just so wonderful. Sebastian, I've kept in touch with. He has moved into graduate school. He'll be graduated by the time I publish this. I learned from him a lot. And he has seized the podcast medium, this visual and audio medium, as a means of telling history stories, of telling stories. And we talk a lot about that in this coming interview. The other thing, though, that was great was with our interview together, and was that he really got what I was trying to do and Play All Night. Probably more than just about anybody ever told me. This was a guy who came to the Allman Brothers completely new and came out with Mountain Jam as his favorite song. We don't talk about this in this interview. We did talk about it in our, Mountain Jam. Wonderful conversation. Sebastian Garcia, a historian. He's going to be going on to get his PhD. You'll hear from him again. We're going to have more conversations from the Crossroads, but we get rolling in all kinds of good stuff. Here's Sebastian Garcia, my good friend. So I'm taking this concept of like long live the ABB conversation from the Crossroads and said, well, wait a second. I'm always talking to like super interesting people who like, follow, good stuff in the world. We see the world for the wonders that it contains. And, it's not just people like you and I who are historians, but it certainly is folks like you and I as well. And you were such an inspiration to me when we did the podcast. It'll be 4 years this October. I can't even believe that. And I was like, I decided this January, I decided to just do it. And I said, you know what? I'm going to record my conversations with my friends. I'm going to put it out into the world. So like I'll have close to a dozen episodes in the queue here by the end of next week. And I'm trying to just do them like weekly. So do you want to roll right into the shit? Or do you want to talk a little bit, catch up, and then I can start asking my questions? What's going to work best for you?
Well, first of all, let me say how flattering it is that I was sort of our conversation back in October of 2022 was, the inspiration for this. I mean, that is obviously wasn't the intention then. I just really loved your book, still do. You inspired me. Yep, there you go. And to this day, it's one of my favorite podcasts I've ever done because we were hitting a note. It
We
was
were.
it was authentic. It was genuine, um, and very, in some ways, maybe not cathartic's the right word, but revealing in the sense that there are some down to earth people, in the academy, so to speak. Historians. Not everyone's sort of the stereotypical, caricatures that we're made out to be. So yeah, no, this is great. We could catch up briefly and then we could start if that's something that works for you.
Yeah. So thank you, by the way. It is a very much a mutual admiration society. And
Mhm.
that was our interview, which I'll put in my show notes, was it was cathartic for me because it was a very lonely launch because I was alone. I took the car, drove all the way down to
Mhm.
Miami and all the way back. And there's a lot that plays in your mind did for me when I launched this book,
Mhm.
like all kinds of things, including the journey of mine that started at UCF in a building that isn't even there anymore, Coburn
Mhm.
Hall. And so it was to reach somebody like you, right? No prior knowledge of the Allman Brothers, really no prior knowledge of I don't know how much knowledge of rock music in general
Mhm.
you had, but it wasn't that kind
No,
of rock music, I know for sure. And
no.
for you to pick up on what I was dropping about, is I put a lot of thought into reaching people like you. Uh, as I unfolded what I was trying to do. And it was like at the very end of that trip, we sat down. If you recall, you weren't keeping track of time, and I
No.
was late to a live Zoom that Dr. French was having. He's
Yeah.
like texting me because I wasn't
Yeah.
either. And we were both just
Yeah.
rolling,
Rolling.
the exact kind of conversation, that we have here. Um, so let's do this. Let's rather than update, let's just keep rolling with this just a little bit. I want to ask you a question just for you about the discipline of history itself.
Okay.
What is, why is it important? Why did it grab you? And it really, when I talk about this, right, like why did it grab Sebastian to the extent that you have pursued it beyond just taking the requisite classes in undergrad? You're getting a graduate master's degree now. You are a wonderful storyteller. You have provided a storytelling medium with genuine history. So where does that come from? Like why history?
Yeah, it's a question that I always reflect on, honestly. In a lot of ways, it's a question that centers me when, things get overwhelmed and there's just so much to do in so little time. It's like, remember your why, right? And so for me, it was history was always something that fascinated me, even in grade school, like K-12. It was always my favorite subject. I was so interested in sort of the our nation's past, decisions that humans have made along the way, and how it can explain how we got here. You know, um, I think for me it was access in terms of like by learning about the past, I was able to better understand my present, which then, in theory, should better inform my future. And that's a very personal sort of aspect of it. But I think that also helped me navigate sort of just life, society, even in an early age, like why things are happening, and, why are we living in the world we live in today? Um, so for me, that was sort of the impetus. Then, secondly, admittedly, it was a subject that because I had that sort of innate passion and curiosity for it, I was really good at it. Like early on, like it was the subject that I always got the awards in, even in, starting in middle school and high school, I would get the social studies awards, the history awards. And so that type of success obviously motivates my path further, where it's like, okay, not only do I like this, but I'm pretty good at it. So blending the two together seems like a smart idea. And so that was um that was sort of my the beginning of sort of my journey here. And you know, in high school in particular, when I took AP US history in 11th grade, that's kind of when it solidified for me that I really enjoyed history, because um that class we had to do these like weekly worksheets from the book that we were reading. And I remember I would be one of the few students that would, like, there would be boxes to fill in the responses, and I would go over the box like with my writing. Like I surpassed the so-called like designated space you needed to respond to this question or concept, because I just enjoyed it. It was something that I learned. I love to learn, in particular about U.S. history. So, but then as I'm sure you know, because I've told you this before, it got complicated in college because I actually entered UCF as a biomedical sciences major, mainly because my parents, my close friends, people around me, um, had a very limited understanding of success, professional success. And that was really along the lines of doctor, lawyer, engineer. And that's pretty much it. So we're talking hard sciences minus the lawyer, minus law. And I grew up in a household of people in the medical field, in healthcare. Both my parents are respiratory therapists. So that was sort of the environment that I was raised in. And of course, as immigrants from Colombia, their MO was partly they wanted a better life for themselves, but also for their children when they came here. And so job security is one way that you could attain that, peace of mind. And it kind of reinforced sort of that limited understanding. It's funny because at the time I was never really angry at them, but I was sort of like annoyed that I had to conform to their understanding of, okay, well, I'll get the biomed science majors, even though deep down I knew that wasn't what I really wanted to do. And
Hmm.
but as I've gotten older and more mature, I understand where they're coming from. It was never from a place of like to put me down or to force something upon me. It was more of a place of we just want what's best for you, and since we're not from here, we don't really know the varied paths you could take to attain the American dream, quote unquote, success. Um, so, um, but yeah, and then, but I can't. I'm very much a person that, um, if I'm not liking what I'm doing, I find a way to do what I like to do because,
Mm.
I just don't roll like that. I don't operate like that. So my third semester as an undergrad, I picked up a history double major. I initially didn't tell them that it was a double major. I just said, "Oh, I'm picking up some history classes to balance out the hard science courses," which is full of shit because the history classes were just as hard as the science classes. Um, so and then slowly but surely, I started to make inroads in the department. And honestly, I realized pretty quickly how lucrative the department here at UCF is, like with the faculty and the professors. I mean, not all, but most of them genuinely care about your development, your well-being, in and out of the classroom. And that's not something that I had experience in the science classes. You know, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of that dynamic because I've been on the other side of campus. So when I tell like people today, whether professors or students, that like value what you have here because this sort of camaraderie and mentorship that is around the department is not guaranteed elsewhere. It's not the norm. I mean, at least it wasn't in the biomedical science world. Um, so. I almost immediately gravitated towards that. And then of course, like even to this day, I mean, literally yesterday I was looking into someone um uh and sort of what they've done recently with their careers and it's all inspiring. I mean, someone like I mean, I started to look into people like I started to realize that these professors were very successful in their craft. How do I get there? And so that was what pulled me to learn more about them and more about the discipline of history. Like from that point on, my understanding of history was not just a subject you learned in school that I enjoyed and that I was pretty good at. Now it was more like, how do I get in the game? You know? Um, so yeah,
A way to see the world,
right.
that is different than what you get. It's still kind of the scientific process, if you will, like hypotheses,
Hmm.
research, conclusion, go back to hypotheses, etc. But it's dealing with a much more infinite kind of set of possibilities. History as a sort of a study or a discipline. From a career perspective, I can totally relate to your parents saying that. Had you talked to me at 19 years old or 18 years old, I would have said your parents are absolutely right. I would have also said I don't for a minute regret the path that I took, even though when I was a younger fella, I didn't know what I was going to do when I got out of college. I didn't know that I could work in museums, which is, I found a job at the History Center in downtown Orlando, and I was already at UCF. So, for everybody's benefit, and I'll do an intro for this, but Sebastian goes to the University of Central Florida, where I went, got my bachelor's degree and my master's degree in 2002 is when I got my master's degree. And I was I wasn't even working in the museum field at the time. Didn't even know it was a possibility. When I published my first book on the Highwayman, like I was like, well, that's the only one I'll ever do. Like
Mm.
it didn't, even though I had written down goals to do it. But I love the concept of, like you saying, get in the game. Like, how do I become a part of this conversation? I think I might have even said this in our interview, in technical writing for my master's degree at UCF. And I'm in this class called Modern Rhetorical Theory. Like, I didn't even understand what rhetorical theory was, much less ancient or modern. Like, I just, and she taught this concept early on about the unending conversation, the fact that we are always kind of engaged in this. That's what the humanities are, et cetera, essentially. And that's how I see my work at, within museums and historical organizations, history organizations, when I teach, when I write Play All Night, or the other ones, is I'm just, sort of engaged in that conversation. And I do think, and I applaud you for this, being a young person, sticking your oar in the water in that very intimidating environment, because you can say the history department is super friendly or this or that, but it is still a bunch of offices with doors and a hallway and human beings who are busy. And it takes some time as a student to navigate all of that. I want to pick at the immigrant parents thing. So you are a second, or you're a first generation American.
First generation American.
Your parents are Colombian. Were you born in America or were you born in Colombia?
No, I was born in America.
Okay. You grew up in, if I recall,
Mi-
Miami.
Miami, Florida. Yes, sir.
So I've got Miami on here as a thing, also the South, because I want to talk to you as a Colombian. Do you go by Latino or Hispanic? What term do you
With
prefer?
whichever.
Either one works. So,
Yeah.
like, you are not Cuban, which is the predominant Hispanic population, Latino population from where you're from. But I
Hmm.
know, because I'm from Florida. I'm from Stewart. So Miami was my big
Hmm.
city. And then I moved to Orlando, which was the next big city, right, that I saw. And I knew a lot of cats from Miami, like a lot of dudes, many of them Cuban. Um, and I know Miami is part of the South, very much so, and yet it's its own sort of culture and community there as well. And, like, let's talk a little bit about that, Miami. Let's talk about growing up in the South. And the piece I want to also see if you can address, whether here or a little bit later, is history as liberation, which I think you were kind of hinting at, about the freedom of sort of understanding what's going on better gives you some sense of I don't know if it's control or but history's liberation is a theme that comes up a lot in my pieces. So I got Miami, got the South, got immigrant parents, and got some history as immigration. Just threw a bunch of notes at you. Um, take it.
No, I want to start with the history as liberation because that's exactly what I was referring to. And it's funny because you phrasing it that way immediately prompts a memory in my head where the first semester of grad school, we're taking historiography, and there was a discussion post. Uh,
Explain historiography for the congregation, please.
so
This is
historiography,
important.
yes, no, it is important. I appreciate that. Historiography is the history of history, right? So basically,
How history
how
has
has
been
been
written,
right, exactly.
because we have to place our work somehow in the context of those who came before. I think this is something, maybe, forgive me for going on a little tangent, but I think this is an important point to talk about out loud with another historian and to the
Mhm.
world, all 72 million people who will watch this over the course of the next 57 years. Um, right? That historians, when we get trained to understand our craft first,
Right.
which I'm just gonna say, I'm gonna speak for myself. You can speak for me. I thought was the dumbest idea in the history of teaching. Like, all I want to do is read more history books, and you want me to read about how we do history right from the start in grad school or in undergrad. I don't know if they do it in undergrad. Like, it was new to me in grad school. It was a new
No,
term.
it was grad school for me. They don't historiography is not a thing in undergrad, at least here at UCF.
Until,
Like,
well, I mean, and I'm a product of that too,
yeah.
but over a 30-year span. So you were in a historiography class. Now I cut you off. Continue with what your definition of historiography is, and then you can go into history as liberation. I love
Well,
this.
yes. Well, it's the history of history, right? So how history has been documented, recorded, written over time. But a crucial part of historiography for, I would say, probably more than for the layman than us, right? Because you hit it on the nail on the head, right? We need to understand how to contextualize our own work with what's come before, and that's sort of the unending conversation that you just mentioned a few moments ago, right? Like what scholarship, what knowledge are we bringing to the table in comparison to what was laid before us, right? How are we building upon that? And building doesn't necessarily mean it has to be some like progressive track, right? We could be correcting past scholarship, right? So it's not a just a positive sort of situation. But um I think something more equally important to historiography is also understanding how the times itself shape the way that the historian writes about the
Yes.
piece. And that is something that honestly is probably my favorite part about historiography because it's so meta, but it's so true, right? So understanding how if someone's writing a book in the 1960s, how did the civil rights movement influence the way in which they approach their work, right? And so understanding that in conjunction with someone who wrote in the 30s, the Jim Crow South, and how that sort of influenced their work, their findings, their interpretation. So it's equally important to understand that historians are human beings, and we are, as much as we shape the times, we are also shaped by the times. So that's something I think that's equally important when talking about historiography. But history as liberation, that's great. So I was in the historiography class, right? And we're like in it's the end of the semester. I want to say like week 11 or week 12. And we just finished reading Joan Scott's Gender as a Category for Historical Analysis, her seminal essay, really about how historians can use gender as a lens to understand the past, relationships, dynamics, and not just between sort of, men to female, but also men to men, masculinity, femininity, all these things. So that comes off really a phenomenal stretch of like the pantheon historians. We just had finished reading Rodiger's Wages of Whiteness. We had just finished reading, I'm blanking on the other person, but it basically was, I remember saying this is sort of the trifecta, right? We've understand now class, race, gender. And so so coming off that, and I'm writing my discussion post. And funnily enough, I think part of the reason why I remember this so vividly was because I was writing this at the library, which was strange because I usually did my work from home, but I was at the library that day. And I remember, and I'm sure I could still find it in my past web courses. I remember writing, if not the exact terminology, like the phrasing you just said, something similar of like understanding these works and the path through those works has been liberating. Like has been, and I think that's what I kind of meant with accessible. Like it's given me access to the world in ways that now I have a deeper understanding of how things work and I can make my own choices because of it, right? I'm not necessarily bound by whatever narratives, people want people to believe. Like I could see through that and then make my own choices from it, professional or personal or whatever.
Mhm.
So no, I love that. Yeah, that's exactly what I was referring to.
Yeah, mine is sometimes, the fear of the hard history, which is, these things. I'm not trying to make these conversations at all timely to a specific current event, but for everybody's benefit, we're recording right now in March of 2026. It's a little bit chaotic, beyond a little bit chaotic out there, and there's an attempt right now to literally whitewash. It's not an attempt at the National Park Service's interpretations. It's a big, big, big deal that I think a lot of people are missing. And I go with you on this one, Sebastian. Mine was also graduate class, fall of 1997. Carrie Frederickson. I can't remember the room that we were in, but we were not in Coburn Hall in the room where I did most of our discussions in there. And it was the history of the New South. And I think we might have said this before. I mean, it blew my mind because that story is my dad. It's my grandparents in the South. I could go to my father and challenge him about a few things. And and I think what it did was I wasn't so afraid of the bad things that, people had done in the past. I was like, okay, understand why we don't want to go down that road again, whatever that is. I mean, like you said, it's not even just a professional level, it's a fundamental kind of personal level. Like when you read about segregation in the American South and the efforts to keep the massive resistance, legit capital M, capital R, massive resistance, it is pathetic. For a region of the country who was as poor as the South was coming out of the Civil War and really all through as they made their transition from, kind of, farm labor, if you will, to mechanization. All of these resources that come pouring in from the New Deal and the Great Society that the South conveniently forgets. And of course, black folk are always left, and that's the story of the South. I know that's not necessarily the story of you, but are always left behind in this. And then we continue like these bad decisions in the present. And that's the part that influences me, not as a historian, but as a citizen, right? So I really appreciate that. History is liberation. So now let's talk about the South. Let's
Yeah.
talk about Sebastian's. Do you consider yourself a Southerner? Why or why not? Do you consider Miami the South? Why or why not? How has the South influenced you? All those questions are open, and you don't have to have finite answers right now on any of those. Those are tough ones, but as a Floridian, I struggled a bit sometimes with, as a South Floridian growing up in this little beach town. This is about the fifth time I've said this on these interviews. Like, am I really a Southerner? And then Stuart, Florida is as deep south as any place south of Lake Okeechobee in the center of the state, going down 27,
Yeah. I think for me, um, I think it's a question that I have engaged with several times. And most importantly, and this is very central to the response, since being in Orlando. So going outside of Miami has
Mm-hmm.
allowed me to understand more about my hometown and its relation with not only the state, but with the region and of course the nation.
Region.
But
I didn't even talk about region. Thank you, because we're talking about, and then you got the international region as well with
right,
the Caribbean. I don't know
right.
if that's what you were talking about.
Yeah.
I'm still thinking about it as the south end of the peninsular state of
Well,
Florida, which is the South. But yes, you've got
yeah,
all of that happening in that magnificent, wonderful community of
yeah.
my what my grandmother used to call Miami.
Yeah.
She was
Yeah. I
down there
love
in the 20s.
I
So
love that. Yeah.
forgive the interruption because Orlando
No,
was
no,
also on my list. So we are hitting it, brother.
no worries. I mean, I think so it's weird. It's interesting because I think being in Orlando for the past almost 7 years now, which is insane to say out loud, um, has made me, if not identify as a Southerner, has made me more conscious of what that even means, right?
Okay.
So I'm not sure if I embrace it or not, but I know what it means. Whereas growing up first 18 years of my life in Miami, like no, we're not Southerners, And Miami is completely, it's like an anomaly from the rest of the state, from the rest of the region, because here's why. And I've told this to several people before. In Miami, growing up, the time that I did, right? Because I'm glad you brought up your grandma, right? Because Miami was not always this Hispanic cultural hub, right? Miami in the 20s was, like any sort of South Floridian town, so to speak.
Lily White.
Right. in the 21st century, it was really rare to see a white person where I grew up. Just that simple. I went to school with people that look, sounded, and talked like me. And here's the most important thing. When I say look, I'm not just saying complexion. I'm talking about the culture.
Hmm.
Because people, there's obviously Hispanics who have more of the European descent, and so obviously have a lighter complexion. But the culture, you know, that's sort of the environment that I grew up, which is very different from sort of traditional understandings of the American South, right?
Hmm.
So like, I grew up, and at least in my household, my parents were very deliberate on speaking to us in Spanish. And then our English comes from school, TV, culture, right? Um, and that was a choice that they made. And that's a choice that a lot of people that I grew up with, all my friends, and when I also went through the same thing, right? But we would, with friends, sure, Spanish will come out occasionally, but we're engaging, we're talking in English the whole time, basically. Um, and so I didn't really, I had no real understanding of what a southerner even meant until I came to UCF, when I was like, whoa. Like it's funny because it's only 4 hours away, but even going to UCF was a huge cultural shock to me. It
Hmm.
was, because now all of a sudden, you know, I'm around people that I wasn't around before, right? In a very like explicit way, right? And so um but it's weird. It's tough. I mean, it's because in these 7 years that I've been in Orlando, and you go and obviously I've go down to Miami frequently. Um, the political landscape of the city has veered more like traditional, Southern, so to speak. And so it's made it it's a very complicated issue. And but one that's so interesting to talk about. And so I think that that's sort of my take on it.
Hmm. But if you were to say like Miamian, Floridian, Southerner, Miami's Miami's the place you and again, who gives a crap about identification? But I'll tell you, I didn't let you answer the questions then. Do you consider yourself a Miamian? Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Um, that was my main question. I mean this reflects my experience with the state with I'm sorry, the state, the state of Miami, which is what
I
Howard
mean, it's
Schnellenberger,
yeah.
which is legit what Howard Schnellenberger called it in the 80s when he took over that program and made it the juggernaut that it was at the expense of my beloved Florida Gators. But it is its own kind of entity. I suppose Tampa is probably the next closest, but the Cuban. Have you ever read The Immigrant World of Ybor City by Gary Mormino
Dude,
about
that's the first interview I ever did in my career with Gary Marino about that book. No, no
we
kidding. First interview ever I've ever done in my career. I mean, since then I've interviewed hundreds of people for radio, podcast, TV, whatnot. That's the first interview I've ever done in my
man.
life.
That was, and I'm pretty sure I read that in a class with Dr. Lecky, which was in later on. She was my thesis advisor. I think it was Lecky. It might not have been, but I do remember I loved that book
Yeah.
for how it talked about something I didn't really truly understand. We had spent some time in Tampa. My dad was from Polk County, so and we go there. That was the big city, if you will. Sometimes this or that, but I haven't spent a lot of time there. Miami was our big city, growing up. And, we'd go to Dolphins games at the old Orange Bowl and
Mm.
concerts occasionally down that way. You know, it was the big city, but it is its own animal. And I'll tell you, I'm hopefully one of these days I'll talk to him, but Mario, one of my buddies from my college days from Miami, um, he says about the exact same thing about coming to Orlando. And the coolest thing about him and all those cats that were my boys, one of a couple roommates, etc., was because they were from Miami, they'd seen a lot of stuff and were very unfazed by the white hippie kids going kind of crazy on college,
Yeah.
like they were, it was just none of it fazed them. There was not a lot of judgment about behavior as long as you were being cool. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah, yeah,
if
definitely.
you were off doing something that seemed a little reckless or stupid, that's cool. We're not messing with it, you know?
Right.
And if some guys were over there doing something they really shouldn't be doing, like selling something or whatever, they just, at Miami was like, you know.
Hmm.
So you find but Mario said the exact same thing. This was the first time I was around, and he'd gone to Columbus High School, the, private Catholic school, all boys school. And so his first time really kind of outside of that environment as well. And liberating to that's I mean, that's the genius of college, I think. One of the greatest things about the college experience isn't really what you learn in the classroom. It's what you learn at this kind of soft launch into adulthood. You learn people are different than you and your immediate family, including your friend. Like, you start your friends, you have different relationships with, more mature relationships as you're learning about life. Like my friends in college in that era, I mean, they taught me so much uh about so many different things. And so did my professors, not quite as much. I wasn't quite as inspired a student as you were. So your concept of the South, you care to define? You said it changed when you moved north to Orlando.
Mhm.
I love that because it is true that, they always say the further north you go, the further south you get in Florida. It's also the more interior you get as well. You get away from the beaches, you get away from the towns. You're getting any little town in Georgia, any little town in Alabama, any little town in Mississippi, South Carolina, etc.
Yeah, yeah, no. I also think for me, a lot of my understandings of the South is also very academic in terms of like I've learned like yeah, being like place-based identity is a real thing, and obviously also being in Orlando has helped me understand sort of what the American South looks like it is. But Orlando is also somewhat of an anomaly because of the theme parks and the tourists. Orlando does tries to sort of paint a more clean, quote unquote, picture of itself and kind of puts all the racial sort of history behind underneath under the rug because they're trying to present themselves to the world. So in a lot, so Orlando's unique too, but I think um, it's sort of the ways in which the legacies of slavery, this, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, how all of that has sort of culminated into the present, right? Like all these major historical phenomenons have had long afterlives, even well beyond their quote unquote expiration, right? Like slavery ended in 1865. But that does not mean that the consequences of chattel slavery and bondage have not been seen in the present, right? Or have not been manifested in the present. Um, and so that and the culture that comes with that, right? The stereotypes that come with that, the understandings of different people, not just black people, white people, like all of that. That's something that I've learned more here than anywhere else. And that's again partly because place-based, but also the profession that I'm in. Like I'm sure if I was in the other timeline, in the worst alternative universe where I don't do where I don't do history and I stay with the biomed sciences, I'm sure I don't have that deep understanding of it. Like I'm a pretty, I'm naturally curious. I'm observant. I'm sure I would have picked up some cues, but I wouldn't have the intellectual foundation that I do now because of, the books that I've read, the professors that I'm with. I mean, some of these professors that I've connected with, their expertise is on the South. So just being in conversation with them, you get to learn more about it. So yeah, things like that.
Yeah, I love how you're sort of processing that. Um, I really do. And not everybody has access to study history the way that we did, but I do think it's super easy to have a sense of curiosity, to not to read things that challenge you, that are based on some sense of scholarship. Like people used to send me, but well, you should read this, and it was some standard trope about something that meant not. I mean, it was just like there was nothing in it but some person's thoughts, and it was literally a repeat of cable news in a book. Right? This will change your mind about the condition of blah blah blah. And I'm like, all I know about slavery and its impact, and then the long tail of white supremacist policies in government, is that I think it was a decade ago, maybe a little more, for every dollar white Americans had, black people had between a nickel and 10 cents. I mean, that level of inequality is historically rooted in these policies that kept black people either enslaved, disenfranchised, away from education. By the time you get to the New Deal, they're not eligible for the home loans that the white veterans are. And I'm only talking about like this one group of folk, and I think it's important that we talk about, right? The South isn't a monolith. The South to you is Orlando and then the South. Miami doesn't fit there. Uh, Black people are not a monolith, even though
Nope.
we in the public sphere we treat them as such, and there's
Yeah.
books out the wazoo and programs and everything else. And Hispanic people are also not a monolith. In
No, definitely not.
fact, y'all are very culturally protective of your flag, if you will, your
Yeah,
country,
yeah, definitely.
to the exclusion often of whatever's going on in other groups. And from the sort of white majority perspective, you look at it and go, all those people should, let's do
Mhm.
an exhibit on Hispanic culture, and all of a
Yeah,
sudden you haven't done this, or like, it's complex. This whole world is super complex. And I know there's time, and I've been fighting this my whole life. There's time to stop and read, to stop and pay attention. That's the whole purpose of this conversation. Stop and let's talk about how to get somewhere, right? How to
yeah,
live a bit of a more fulfilled life. And it is, cracking books open and having your mindset challenged is one way we do it.
yeah,
It manifests itself at a museum for me, right? Or at a historic site, or at a public program, or watching a documentary, or listening to a show. Um, but it's storytelling. And
yeah.
you've spent a lot of time with the storytellers, and you yourself, I mean, you're a great storyteller. I'm not blowing smoke. Like we've had lots of long conversations. So, but you said I want to get in the game, and you have like I want to give you a chance to sort of toot your horn a bit on the efforts that you've done. Focus on the things you want people to pay attention to, right? What are your highlights? Um, because you've chosen to there's multiple ways to do history. The most common way is to become public school teacher or try to become a college professor, which is really a very difficult proposition, but it's doable. Then there's a whole bunch of people like me who just make their living, doing these things. So yeah, let's talk a little bit, because that's how we met, was your podcast.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because, and I said this not too long ago. I was invited to speak at a class, the Professionalizing History Majors undergraduate course, which is not new. It did exist when I was an undergrad, but the difference is that it's a required course, and when I was an undergrad, it wasn't. So that's why I never took it. But yeah, I was invited to speak with some other former alum, or people out in the professions applying their history training in the real world. And I said this to them the other day. I was like, I started off podcasting because, kind of like how I got into history, it was something that I allowed me to channel my inner curiosity. I love to pick people's brains, particularly interesting people. And I use interesting intentionally. It's vague. What's interesting depends on the context. You know, in the professional setting, you may be interested in because you're just a genuinely awesome human being like you are. When you add sort of the all the things you've accomplished, that makes it even more interesting, right? And sort of learning your journey and things like that. So without sort of intent, like I was never intentional with sort of podcasting as like that's going to be my brand, that's going to be my signature move. If we go to basketball, which I love, like the most famous players of all time have a signature move, right? Jordan, it's fadeaway. Kareem is the skyhook. Hakeem Olajuwon is the dream shake, so on and so forth. For me, I wasn't like, oh yeah, podcasting, that's my signature move. So I got into it because it was another way to allow me to grow my own network with people and talk to them about history. And that was Knight's History Cast. That's the show that I interviewed you in. Um, and also I was an avid consumer of podcasts. I consume to this day. In fact, I was listening to one right before I got on.
Mhm.
And not necessarily about history. In fact, my most streamed podcasts aren't really about history. They're about sports, uh, media, pop culture. Um, so, but nevertheless, sort of the podcast that I was listening to, I would think to myself, this is very complimentary to history. Like I think, history. What's in the word history? A story, right? So, like, fundamentally, we are storytellers. Fundamentally, we are telling stories about the past, right? And there's ways that we obviously, do that. Like you mentioned earlier, the sort of scientific method approach of it. But when you have a medium that has found its success in telling stories and people chatting, well, historians love to chat and historians love to tell stories. So put the two together, and I think that's a happy marriage. So that was sort of my calculus, and I've been very fortunate that the people here at UCF have supported me in my endeavors. I, I also recognize sort of that they've been incredibly supportive in my ambitions because it was ambitious. I was like, well, once I've connected with the former podcast producer, excuse me, for the department, Holly Baker, major shout out to her. She's really the start of my story. And without her, I wouldn't be here. And she connected me with Dr. French, who was her supervisor as the podcast producer. She was looking to step down. She found a successor in me. I had proven myself previously with an internship at the Florida Historical Society by producing a radio segment about Dr. Mormino's book of Ybor
Ah,
City. So
okay.
that was my first interview for my first ever radio segment, and this summer it will mark 4 years since I did that. Yeah, 4 years ago.
Congratulations.
So it was through that internship that I connected with Holly, proved myself to her. When she told me I'm looking to step down as the podcast producer, that was my way in. I'm like, oh, this is golden. She then connected me to Dr. French, who I did not know previously because I never took a class with him. Still, I did end up taking one class in grad school, but never had taken a class before. Um, and from there, that's how I got the position of podcast producer for the department. Just
How many
to
did so you were so the let me summarize
yeah.
this one real quick. Like you were just a student. You consumed the
Mhm.
media. We're going to talk about sports in a second because we have had that discussion and I want to share some of that for everybody's benefit. And you said, "Hey, I'll try that. I like to talk to interesting people." Well, actually, you said I like to talk to interesting people. I'll try that. And it turned out to be like right up your alley. You have a great, resume there that you're using. You've you've done how are you still doing that show, Knight's History Cast?
So
And if
yes,
not, no, okay. I was gonna say,
well,
what are you doing? I was trying to lead into that some of the other
yeah,
projects you're working on. So yeah.
yeah. No, no, I appreciate you. No, so I say yes because it's not like a closed show, right? It's active in the sense that I have interviews in the can that I just haven't gotten to because I've been working on these other projects that I'm going to share in a moment. Um, and it's still an ongoing production. I mean, that's somewhat the beauty of Knight's History Cast since it's just an interview show. It's not a limited run series, so it's perpetual, right? As long as the lights are on, it could keep going. And
Uh-huh.
the lights are on, so to speak. So, but what's what's taken me away from Night's History Cast in a good way is producing a narrative podcast series called The Memory of Negro Fort Podcast. And this is a podcast that tells the story of the largest autonomous community of runaway enslaved people and Native Americans in the history of the United States. And more importantly, the memory of that community. So this community, which first its name started off as Prospect Bluff. This was a fort that was built by the British during the War of 1812 along the panhandle of Florida. So about 70
Off
mile,
off the coast of Apalachicola,
yes, the
correct?
Apalachicola River.
A Big Bend.
It sits atop a high bluff along the river, and it's about 70 miles southwest of present-day Tallahassee. So the War of 1812, the British built this fortification as a base of operations to launch their southern invasion against the United States. And a major element to this campaign was to recruit Native Americans and runaway enslaved people from the American South and also Spanish Florida. Because keep in mind, at this time, Spain controlled Florida, although very weakly, and that's partly why the British were able to leverage and that status and build a fort there. Um, the War of 1812 concludes with the famous Battle of New Orleans that Andrew Jackson leads. But what's important is that sort of prompts the British to leave their fortifications. But they don't take it down. They leave the structure intact. And more alarmingly to white Southerners across the Florida Georgia border, they leave a stockpile of weapons, ammunitions, boats, uniforms, muskets, cannons, really everything you need to maintain your autonomy and survive in the Florida wilderness. And also protect yourself against an encroaching American assault, which most people had anticipated will happen. Um, why the British left this? That's where you should listen to our podcast. Uh, so um, basically, Andrew Jackson and other white Southerners like Benjamin Hawkins um, start to paint a picture of this fort as villainous, uh, that needs to be destroyed. It's disrupting the peace of our border. It's enticing more slaves to run away. These large claims that have largely been unfounded, um, based on the historians that we were able to interview that have done a lot of work on the site itself and the community around it. These the formerly enslaved Black people and Native Americans really just wanted to be alone. They could have very easily used those advantages of a physical defense and military might to launch a revolution against sort of their American enslavers or incite a revolt, but they didn't. They had for about a year autonomy in the Florida wilderness, being a self-sustained community. And so ultimately, in July 1816, Andrew Jackson launches an illegal, unconstitutional invasion on foreign soil, because remember, this is still in Spanish Florida, against this Negro fort. Now it's called the Negro Fort, and this is a derogatory term that the American soldiers and statesmen labeled as a way to, again, paint them as these villainous um, uh, murderers, enticers of, taking away more slaves from Georgia planters and the like. Um, and there's a battle that ensues, and it's a pretty long battle. The fort defends themselves pretty successfully against the Americans, so much so that the Americans try to convince the fort to surrender, even though the fort has displayed an incredible might and defense. Obviously, the leader of the fort, Garcon, uh, sort of laughs at this attempt to surrender and scolds them away and raises the red flag of no surrender. It's meaning that they rather die than be re-enslaved and live in bondage. Um, Sort of famously, a cannonball hits the top of the fort where all the gunpowder sat, and there's this huge explosion, and it kills most of the occupants of the fort. And so that's essentially the history, quote unquote, of the fort, and we're focusing on the memory. But of course, what I just recounted is very necessary context to understand how then throughout the 19th, 20th, and even 21st century, various groups of Americans have invoked the memory of this community and for contemporary political, social, and cultural reasons. Um, and so that's the Memory of Negro Fort podcast. I mean, this is a bookmark for your viewers. I mean, obviously they
Oh,
can't scan, but it's the Memory of Negro Fort podcast. It's available wherever you listen to your podcast: Apple, Spotify, Google. Sorry, not Google. Google Podcasts doesn't exist anymore. Amazon, Podchaser, etc. Just
we'll put
find,
that in the notes too. So
yeah.
let me add some context to this story too for everybody's benefit. Everybody remember, the War of 1812 ends at Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815. So yes, the war ended after they had already signed surrender terms sometime, I think, in late 1814. That's how news traveled. Just
Yep.
down the road from New Orleans is Mobile, and right after that is
Mm-hmm.
Pensacola, and
Mm-hmm.
continuing in then would be all of this is Spanish Florida. Florida up against Georgia, Alabama. Um, and one of the things that I did not know until I started studying this or thinking about it was the freedom seeking journey from north to south. We always think of the Underground Railroad as going north, and the famous names that we know from there, Harry Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and Robert Smalls goes north, etc. But a whole bunch of people, I mean, from the minute Africans came as enslaved people to American soil, they left, they ran away and joined up with the native peoples. That's a story as old as time, happened in Florida as well. The other thing that happened in Florida that provides some context is Spanish control of Florida during the War of 1812. This is their second tenure in Florida. They lost it during the American Revolution, right? That's when it came from, right? Coming out of that, right? So Spain has a
Yep.
real tenuous hold. The whole empire is crumbling at this point, and
Mm-hmm.
Florida's kind of worthless. It's full of mosquitoes and swamp, and so it's easy for people, enslaved Africans, to migrate south and make their way to living with native communities. Now, the other thing that has happened in Florida, for everybody's benefit, is the native Florida population, when the Spanish got there, is basically decimated and gone. And the indigenous population at this point, we call today Seminoles, several different bands of Seminoles speaking different languages, Muskogee and Creek, but also Seminole is a very loosely directed term, and there are Seminoles in Oklahoma, there's Seminoles still in Florida who never surrendered. This was the start. I'm assuming you're going to talk about this in your podcast of what we call the First Seminole War.
Yep. Absolutely.
And one of the key people that's at the Negro Fort who escapes is Abraham, Negro
Yep.
Abraham, they
Yep.
call
Yep.
him.
Yep.
He
Yep.
becomes an emissary to the Seminole Nation, if you will. I mean, during the Second Seminole War, which happens 1835 to
Mm-hmm.
1842. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why Florida gets populated in the interior, because they were building forts every 15 to 20
Mm-hmm.
miles apart. That's why Orlando becomes a city. It's not on a river, it's not on a railroad. It's smack dab in the middle of nowhere. And that's because they built a fort there, and around
Mm-hmm.
that grew this community. So what Sebastian's talking about, and then is the issue of Black Seminoles, which is what we called them back in the day. There's been books written about them, but there is a whole movement of freedom seekers who come south, and some Black Seminoles take canoes all the way to the Bahamas. Some remain in Florida, but Abraham and his contingent made a different deal with the United States Army during the Second Seminole War, kind of sold out the Seminoles who were protecting them, and went west as long as they were promised that they weren't going to be re-enslaved. Abraham was at this Negro fort that we're talking about. It is legit called that on the maps,
Mm-hmm.
Negro fort. I have seen the maps. And it was an international incident because you're attacking a former British installation on foreign soil. It is Spanish territory. And when you talk public memory, we're going to do public memory because I talk about that a lot on this show. There's history, there's the thing that happened, and then there's how we remember it. And you've talked a lot about these. I'll share my greatest aha moment in a historiography class. There's that word again. I'm reading this book called Peter Novick's That Noble Dream: Objectivity and the American Historical Experiment. I see you nodded. You clearly had to read it too. The book itself is thick, and it was probably my favorite part of it was my favorite historiography book I read because it literally broke down the American historical profession within universities, how it became the way that it became, but also the guiding point was there was this rationalist idea that we were empty vessels receiving empty documents, and we could be objective about all of our work, that we were not at all interjected into it. He called it that noble dream, and it is a noble dream that we can be objective. But the fact of the matter is, we're not. And indeed, even the very notion of writing a source down itself is a non-objective or subjective act. I believe this is important, so therefore I wrote it down. That it somehow makes its way into an archives or a museum in and of itself is yet another series of decisions, and then the researcher, him or herself, finding it. So it's we got to try to be as careful as possible there, but we are not empty vessels when we come to this. So when a historian writes anything about the past, they are making an assertive, subjective statement about their findings. 100%. When a community puts up a marker or a monument or a memorial, that memorial says zero about history and everything about what the people who put that marker up want you to think about the past. That's what memory is. That's what public memory is. And public being the things that we encounter out in the world, not just our work with podcasts, books, articles, those sorts of things. Talk to me about public memory in your understanding as well. Expand upon that thing, and any examples that you have too that you want to share.
Um, Historical and public memory has been one of the most fascinating concepts that I've learned in my time as a grad student here. Um, and it's been and I give a lot of credit to this project and my co-producer, John Lancaster, who's also a grad student here at UCF in history department, because his thesis is about historical memory. And so that's sort of my sort of impetus to create a public history project about slavery in Florida, which is where this podcast was born. It was born in Dr. Gannon's graduate colloquium on American slavery in the spring of 2024. The final assignment for that class was to create a public history project about Florida slavery. And so, and it was a group project. So me and John partnered, and I brought my whole podcasting toolkit to the table. He brought the memory. And then when we were doing more research about Negro Fort, which we learned in the class through one of the recent books, Matthew Clavin's The Battle of Negro Fort, came out in 2019, we found a gap in the scholarship that knows there hasn't been a study really about the memory of this community. So how have people remembered and erased? Because erasure is just as important to remembrance when we talk about public memory. It's also what they don't include in those monuments and memorials and so on and so forth that informs sort of what they want people to know about the past and what they want people to know about their community's sense of identity. Um, and so that's sort of how this project came about. And I've learned a lot about historical memory through it because that's been our major sort of lens to understand the subject. And it's changed. It's it's one of those other like historiography moments that I had when we come back to sort of why studying all this is so important and liberating and whatnot. Like understanding memory really changes your worldview.
Yeah.
Like it really unlocks this almost like multi-dimensional understanding of what you're seeing, hearing, feeling. It unlocks a lot of understanding sort of your present moment, because that's what memory is. It's more about the present than it is about the past.
Yeah.
Um,
It's that, Sebastian, that was one of the hardest concepts I ever could wrap my brain around as a professional historian in the public realm. That y'all heard him talk about public history. That's a term really that is reserved for people like him and me within the academy. We are studying a slightly different type of history, but frankly, all the professors are the same, all the outputs are the same. We do genuinely, generally think about our work in terms of this kind of conversation and deeper conversations and books and like we're not thinking about impressing other scholars. We want to. Well, I don't know that we want to. We want our work to stand up in the world, but we are not out there only solely shilling our work for our colleagues and peers. We do want it to reach people for for their own understanding. So just to clarify the public history side, because it is different.
yeah, I'm glad you
It is,
clarified it, because
yeah.
it's something that and I've been asked this question more frequently because of all the work that I've been doing, in my career so far, that's very public oriented. And they're like, "Oh, are you in the public history track?" And I'm like, "No, I'm in the, history, just regular history track." And it's because when I applied for this program, I I didn't know there was a distinction between history, academic history, and public history, because I've always believed that history is inherently public. It comes back to the
All
whole,
history is public history.
yeah,
Yeah. It,
it comes back to the accessibility, right? Like
yeah.
it's history is one of the most accessible subjects out of all the things people in college teach about. I mean, anyone grab someone from the street and they have a sense of history, right? You grab that same person, do they have a sense of sociology, psychology? I don't know, you know? And it's not to discredit those other fields. I'm just saying history is inherently about us and the past. And there's a linkage that connects the two. And so that's what makes it accessible. And so I always thought history was inherently public. So when I started to learn about this public history, it took me a while, honestly, to understand what it meant, because it was confusing. I know what it means now. In the context, like you just said, it's more for us in the academy internally.
It's only
Yeah,
I'm gonna say like go ahead, tell about your historian. Like that's what you do, because
yeah,
to say you're a public historian, I'm guessing most people, and I've never even done this, but this is just a thesis, a hypothesis, but right, like I'm guessing most people have no, if you say public history, they are like, isn't all history supposed to be public history?
yeah,
Like that would be,
yeah,
you know, to me, like it's a pedantic, somewhat pedantic
yeah. It
academic
is.
argument. Like I'm
Yeah.
aware I got my PhD in public history because my university, they started the PhD in public history because we already had two PhD history programs in the state. Like that's one way that
Mhm.
universities were able to do that. But it's, I mean, I have, you know, 10 years of graduate school behind my belt, thesis, dissertation, and 4 books. You're producing things out of the world. Like that distinction really only matters when you're at a conference or talking to other nerds. Like
Well,
we are historians who are sharing our work with the world, right?
it's two things. It's like, what do most people like when they travel, right? And what do most people do in these places that they go visit? They go to museums, heritage sites. That's history, like that they're learning about the place, right, through the past and culture and all that. So that's why it's very confusing for, you know saying public history. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. And then it's also like, it's like, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm going to butcher this, and it's pretty embarrassing because it's your show and that's why I'm asking. But it's like, when I think, was it Dwayne that said it's like calling Southern rock rock rock.
That was Greg who said that,
Greg,
and
yeah,
yes,
yes,
you know what? Thank you. Let's bring it on back to
yeah,
the Allman
yeah.
Brothers here, because that's a great point. He's Those of y'all who are following me strictly for the Allman Brother lens and not the not the historian nerd lens, right? The discussion has always been, are the Allman Brothers Southern rock as that genre that we think about Marshall Tucker Band and Lynyrd Skynyrd and Charlie Daniels Band and 38 Special and all that. And there's this, Greg has this famous quote, all rock music comes from the South. You might as well call it rock, which is absolutely 100% true. Also, right, the distinction is not his because he doesn't care. He's just an artist, right? And in our case, I mean, the less we care. Titles matter in big institutions, having the stripes on your sleeve and stuff. People do size you up along according to those things. And that's not just our business. That's not just our
No.
field. That's the world,
Yeah.
as we go through. Hey, I want to talk about sports a second because this is also another way to bring the Dwayne equation in. I think I've told you before, uh, graduate school, for the benefit of the group, you basically read a book a week and you go in and are expected to talk somewhat intelligently about that book. And it's a skill that you develop over the course of your time in there, being able to devour arguments enough that you could talk about them, but also understand how to quickly do that again if you need the material. I think that, that's what the purpose is for training it. Drove me nuts, drove me freaking bonkers because I was like, I want to learn. I can't learn when I'm reading this fast. So one of the things that I did, because you read so much, was after Christmas time, Christmas time started at the end of the semester for the summer, I would always go to the library and I would get out books about the Celtics, other rock and roll biographies and stories, and it wasn't just the Celtics, the ABA, all these things. And one of my best books that I know I've commended to you before is David Halberstam's Playing for Keeps, Michael Jordan and the World He Made. And Halberstam, probably more a journalist than a historian, wrote a
Mhm.
number of history books in his time before he died, I think in a car accident. But this is about the NBA I grew up with. So coming out of the 70s, going into the 80s, and really into the 90s, Jordan and his run of excellence. And what made Michael Jordan Michael Jordan. And the piece, I guess, that I bring to is in studying Dwayne Allman, in studying the Allman Brothers Band, one of the things that became like really clear to me that a way to tell a story outside of the standard ways you do it is to think about a rock and roll, think about art made in a team setting as in sports analogies. And it opened up my understanding of history and a way to tell a story, and in the case of this was what drove the basis of Halberstam's book is what drove Michael Jordan to such greatness, what was going on with his peers in that era, and then how he became who he was and how the NBA became what it became, which is the NBA that you inherited,
Mhm.
the global sport that
Mhm.
and I'm pretty sure I probably commended that to you because I noticed we were simpatico in that realm. Like I really loved Bill Simmons's book of basketball and
Mhm.
loved his Grantland site when he had it for the similar reasons. Like it was like, oh, okay, there are ways we can tell these stories in less pedantic ways. And for me, there's ways to understand leadership and greatness outside of just art. In my case, a book about Dwayne Allman and the Allman Brothers. And you mentioned you listen to a lot of sports podcasts, and so it made me think about how does sports relate. And we have yet to talk about what your research area is, um, but how does it impact your work? And then we'll do research area. Got community question, and then we got to do our catch up. So
So yeah, full disclaimer, Bill Simmons is who I was listening to right before getting on this call. He's what they call him as well, the Podfather. I mean, he's somewhat that I listen to a lot for his NBA analysis and really admire from afar his career because he's also um carved out his own space, starting, with the Boston Herald, I think, and then going to ESPN, and then sort of creating Grantland, 30 for 30, podcasting, and then taking all that stuff with him when he left ESPN. So very interesting career that I think in a lot of ways, for me, I find some inspiration in the sense of you really can make your own path. It's going to be difficult, that's for sure. There's no sort of naive, rosy lens to it, but there's ways where you could still do, do your craft and not rely on sort of these big institutions. But yeah, his book of basketball, it's somewhere there. It's an awesome book. Um, and I think to your point, it really goes back to understanding that there's not one way to tell a story. Because Bill Simmons, like the author you mentioned, is not a historian. He's a journalist. Um, who always claims now that his fingers don't work to write or type, which is, whatever. He just wants the podcast. He doesn't want to write anymore. But
Does writing's a
yeah,
whole different animal for sure.
yeah. So, but his book of basketball is incredibly informative, incredibly insightful, and incredibly entertaining because he knew how to tell these stories about the NBA's past in ways that not only sort of explain the lore, because there's lore when it comes, especially with these like these sort of sports, art, music, like these sort of things that we all love. There's lore attached to all of it, right?
Memory.
Memory, exactly, and that memory is part of the lore, right? That's what informs the lore and the mythology. And I think a good author not only talks about it, but almost demystifies it in a way,
Yes.
and that's what he does in that book, right? And so um, for me, the influences of his work has been more seen in sort of my podcasting style. So like especially early on with Night's History Cast, like I really tried to emulate his style of interviewing, his style of setting up a conversation at the beginning of the episode and then closing it with sort of an outro and what's next, sort of emulating his style, conversational. He's always said that the best podcasts are ones where it's, just talking to your friends like at a bar or at your house, and I think that's what we're doing now.
That's
And
what it feels like. That's
yeah.
what I want to do too.
And
Exactly that.
and so while still being he said this before, while still being like the smartest guy in the room, like the nerds. Like, he wants to be around nerds, but have that sort of friendly atmosphere, so to speak. So, um, but I mean, in writing, I mean, it's always trying to, especially with this the Memory of Negro Fort podcast, since it's a narrative podcast, which means there's a lot of writing. We write scripts for it. We write our narration along with the sound bites that we edit, the voice actors that we get, and we place in the audio. I think it's all about just how to make the writing accessible, right? Like I know I keep coming back to that word in our
Yeah.
conversation, accessibility. And ironically though, because of certain perceptions about professors and professional historians, there's often we have to be very conscious of how we present history to the public. And one way that we could do that is by making the writing more accessible, right? Which sometimes conflicts with what we are trained to do in grad school, which is very frustrating, admittedly. And that's why this project has, in a lot of ways, been cathartic because it's been an outlet for us to really write in ways that we want people to know. This is not just something for my committee and only for my committee, like for some.
Is this your thesis project?
No, it's
It's
not.
not, right?
No, no, it's not my thesis project. This is something completely on the side. Um, but it's required equal, if not more work than my thesis.
It sounds like it. And
Yeah.
the thing I know from experience with editing and writing is you can the longer you can edit and slice and dice, like the more time you have of something, the better you can do that with. And then there's a finite end, and you're like, I can't slice another word out of this. Um, but yeah, it sounds to me like that is a thesis,
Yeah.
level work, if not beyond that, done sheerly for the love of it.
Yeah, I mean, where we are, what's made this project special is that um, I was able to secure external funding for it. I pitched it at a conference at the American Historical Association, which, for those who don't know, it's one of the most prestigious conference for practicing historians in the U.S. And I was invited to pitch a developing podcast project at the conference a year ago in 2025. And like I try to do always, I mean, sometimes not successful, and that's fine, is, put your best foot forward and you never know what happens. And so that's what I did. I pitched it, and there was someone in the audience who expressed interest in potentially funding the project. And so we worked with this person throughout the first half of 2025. We worked with people here at UCF in terms of how to accept a potential gift for this project and how to institutionalize it in the sense of like the mechanisms, bureaucracy, things that people don't want to really hear about because it's not fun and it's very frustrating, but it's important skill to learn and one that you don't learn in the classroom. So that's another reason why I am
Good point.
grateful for this project. Um, and we were able to secure the funding from this donor. And so there's and that's what's taken this project to a whole other level professionally, but also, you know, there's passion, obviously there's love for this, but it does
You're
help
getting
that
it,
there's
this is a job.
compensation. Yeah,
Yeah, dude,
exactly.
let's, yeah, we don't need to pussyfoot around this.
That's
Like,
what I'm saying. Yeah.
it is, our work isn't free. It looks
Right.
free. And here's a
Yeah.
pitch to become a member of at longlivetheabb.com, because I need more paid members to keep this going. And so, like, you're able to show your parents a little bit of that too, because you said, there's a little family pressure there. And I
Hmm.
can relate to that, too. Let's talk about how you find community.
All right.
Where
Yeah,
do
let's do it.
you find community in this chaotic world with all this going on? And it doesn't have to be just the history side of things either.
Yeah, that's family. Family and friends. I'm fortunate where I'm still really close with my parents. With my fiance, soon to be wife, which is very exciting.
Mazel tov.
Yeah.
Felicidades.
Thank you, thank you. It's that, man. I mean, honestly, that's what ultimately keeps me grounded, because it is a chaotic world, like capital W, like outside everything, and then the inner world of you know trying to do your job and the academy and all that stuff. So, um, yeah, that's for me. Like I've been really fortunate where I could rely on them and sort of um detach when I need to. But honestly, community is also with people like you, like professors that I've not all of them, let me be clear. This is like you said, it's not around this. Some are, you know, I know where we stand in our relationship, and they're not ones that I'm going to seek out,
Right.
intentionally and ask for advice and catch up and this, that, and the other. But for the few that I do have that relationship with, it's incredibly cathartic and helpful for not and helpful in the sense of sure there's things um that I could learn from them still in terms of professional advancement, all these things, but just having someone in your corner in this world. Like, you're out there in the ringer, you're getting your shit smacked. It's a tough world out there. And to know that I have someone like you and some other professors in my corner when I need relief helps a lot, you know.
Yeah.
So that's where I find community at least.
Yeah, it sounds to me, and this is interesting. You're one of the youngest folks I've talked to at this point. You might be the youngest, and you're still in that environment where that institution is a place where you have found a home. And that's great because once you get out of the world, right, then it starts to become social clubs or hooping it or working out or church, these kinds of various ways. And what I like to talk to people about a lot is, how are you seeking the world outside of yourself? Because we get this hyper individualist strain in our minds. It's sort of pushed down our throats with rhetoric. And frankly, right, we get along because of each other, because we have to, number one, I mean, that was my first one, is we're all here, man. Like, like we might as well get along, and we can all have a little. I think there's plenty here. And so, for me, it's like making sure that my listeners and friends are aware of these, these wider things that are out there, and family's an important one, like friends, and friends at the stage you are in life, like young adulthood, are the ones who will stick with you, especially if you live there for a long time. We were in Orlando for about 18 years, I think, by the time we left, between, I always say I went to college in the pros in Orlando, had kids, started my career, got my master's degree, and then, signed a free agent contract up here in Nashville kind of thing. But community is there. And I think, like you say, you find community and like-mindedness. And I think like this is something we share, a curiosity about the world. And I like to inculcate that sense in people around me and myself, right? So I'm man, I'm gonna hit pause here in a second. I want to say thank you. You are an inspiration to me, and I don't need you to say that back to me, but y'all don't know, but I rolled in a pretty tired old grumpy historian when I met Sebastian at my alma mater to talk about my book, and it was the most wonderful reception from him and from the department. I hadn't been there in a number of years, and so it's great to talk with you. You are let's do real quickly. How do we find you? And then we're going to go over. We're going to start talking about your thesis stuff on the flip side here. Do a quick one on that before we get off camera, and then we're going to talk deeper. But your thesis, what are you studying, and then how do people find you?
So I am currently studying the history of radio broadcasting in the 20th century American context. I'm particularly interested in um, radio broadcasting when it was invented, so to speak, or when it became a mass cultural medium in the 1920s. Per, I'm using Governor Alfred E. Smith, who was the governor of New York State, basically for the entire 20s. I'm using his career as a case study to understand how politicians of his era used the new media of the time, which was radio, to secure political action, generate political advocacy, um, and implement reforms through speeches and drive radio drives and things of that. So, um, what makes Smith an interesting case study, though, is that he is a second generation Irish Catholic immigrant born in New York City on the Lower East Side. So in the 1920s, America was increasingly Protestant, xenophobic, and nativist, meaning, we think of things like the Immigration Act. One of the most restrictive immigration acts in U.S. history was in the 20s. Isolationism, this was a United States that did not want to be involved with the world and had a very uh, sort of vision of America in terms of whiteness. And Smith was white, but not the white that, he was an Irish, right? And there's a
And
difference.
Catholic.
And Catholic, exactly. So,
That was the thing.
yep. And so that sort of his identity combined with his rise in politics makes his career very interesting generally. But what a lot of Smith's biographers and scholars and historians have missed is how the radio offered, in a lot of ways, um, an antidote to sort of supersede those obstacles for him.
To break the barrier in communication,
Right.
telling stories. Like this
Yeah.
relates exactly to all of this work you've done at UCF.
Right. And
All of
and
it.
yes, and it's something that he really and he had, I mean, and Smith biographers have noted this, he had a very powerful extemporaneous style. He really knew how to captivate a room. And so when you pair that with this powerful technology of the time, it made for an even greater sort of impact. But again, his identity as an Irish Catholic attracted ideological opponents. So there's this radio station in New York City that formed in response to his rise in the medium with the call sign WHAP, We Hold America Protestant. And so this radio station started broadcasting anti-Smith, anti-Catholic propaganda essentially broadcast to directly undermine his growing prestige. But what makes this even more fascinating is that juxtaposing those two characters in a way really allows us to understand how quickly the idealist assumptions of a new technology quickly erode by the end of the 1920s.
I can
People,
all
yeah,
see the parallels to the podcasting and online world as
yeah,
well. Like today, like the idealism
yeah,
even I felt
yeah,
going
yeah,
into the social media days is
exactly.
gone.
Because there's this, and historians of technology, which is what I'm aspiring to be, like that's the sort of the broad specialty. There's this concept of technological utopianism, this idea that every new
Hmm.
technology that comes is supposed to rectify the existing problems
Oh,
of
are we not in the
society.
middle of that right now? Oof.
Exactly. And
What's
so,
old is new again.
right, exactly. And radio very much reflected those assumptions. There's this historian, Douglas Craig, who I'm relying a lot on for my thesis. I'm building upon his work. We go back to historiography, right? His work has been very influential for my thesis in the sense that he uh, argued that people in the 1920s um, place such idealism in the radio to rectify existing problems like politics. And he labeled this radio exceptionalism. This idea that the radio was supposed to held a special destiny from its predecessors like newspapers. And the general consensus is that by the 1930s, with people like Father Coughlin, Hitler, Mussolini, that this radio exceptionalism has eroded. Right now, if these are the people that are using radio to such a successful rate, what do we mean that the radio is supposed to be this sort of savior, right? This political panacea. My argument is that this actually starts before, right in the 20s, with radio station WHAP, right? Um, so that's my thesis right now, and
You
it's
guys, so I want everybody to listen to how he just talked about all of that in relation to the conversation that we had. So one of my ideas here is to open the open the curtain a little bit to how we do things. Like this is a graduate student, y'all. Like this is a guy who who is doing this kind of out of the sheer love of the thing and perhaps maybe to take another level of effort. But he's written to my feeling several books here. He will have written several book level manuscripts of work. And that's just fantastic. And I can't let radio go by without mentioning, of course, part of what makes radio is so crucial to music in the 20th century and to the Allman Brothers story. So I got to bring it back into the Allman Brothers just a hair. He's talking about Sebastian probably mainly at this point about AM radio, the really
yes, AM radio.
lower audio fidelity signal, but much stronger. That really predominates once we figure out how to kind of harness the airwaves. And then out of that grow all of these radio stations where they start broadcasting all kinds of things, including music. And music becomes this is one way black music begins to truly permeate, no pun intended, the airwaves. I mean, it is not a pun. Black music permeates the airwaves because when they play it, people respond. And so radio is an incredibly important technology. We don't even think about it as a technology anymore, right? But what we are doing right now would have been done on radio 100 years ago. And it
Mm-hmm,
would have
mm-hmm,
sounded crackly, and we would have not been
mm-hmm,
able to do it remotely, I don't think, not
mm-mm,
easily.
no.
And then the other, you mentioned the Lower East Side, of course. Fillmore East was located at 6th Street and 2nd Avenue, 105 2nd Avenue, in the East Village of New York City, where Alfred Smith was from, in the deeply Irish and
Mm-hmm,
immigrant neighborhoods of the Lower East Side. So I
mm-hmm.
couldn't let that one go by without
No,
without saying you've
I I
referenced
love
my
it.
boys. You
I
gave me
love
just a
it.
little bit to play with.
Yeah, I love
All
it.
right, I'm gonna pause the recording. Thanks again. Oh, Sebastian, how do we get a hold of you? How do people find you if they want to talk to you?
So I do have an Instagram that's for my professional sort of account. Um, it's sebgarcia.history is my tag, but you could really find me at on Instagram, Blue Sky, the Memory of Negro Fort podcast. Simple as that. And that's if you want to chat, I'll chat through that account. That's where my mind's at right now. So the Memory of Negro Fort podcast on Instagram, Blue Sky. That's where you can find me. And hopefully
All
enjoy
right.
the show.
All right. Of course they will. Of course. We'll put
Yeah.
that in the show notes too. So the thing that you talked about today about place and place being like such an important part of the historical equation. Like you can't divorce place from the story, just like you can't divorce the person from or people that the story, but we tend to. Miami impacts who you are and who you will become, just like Orlando and specifically East Orlando UCF community, right? My Orlando place, I was there a month ago, is the downtown community, right? That's where once I left UCF, moved down to, and it impacted me is where I worked, or where I went to church. It was, where we did our playing, between the library and the movie theaters and concerts and the parks and everything else.
Well, it's
Place matters.
it's like we said it's earlier, nothing's a monolith, even these places, right? Like you that's why I love how you mentioned East Orlando, because East Orlando is different from West Orlando, and there's historical roots into that, racial roots into that, of course. Same thing with Miami, right? We most people who aren't from Miami think of Miami as this party city and this, beach town. I mean, those things are true to a certain extent, but Miami is not a monolith. Downtown Miami is different from the suburbs, which is where I grew up, like Westchester, Kendall, Sweetwater, Homestead, all these
Homestead,
places.
yeah.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
you can get, some super rural areas of Dade
yeah.
County that all count, as part of Miami. And I think that like we have an obsession with place sometimes as well. Like I am this or I am from this and we mean this or we mean that. And there is a Southern mindset. If it's not a political or sociological mindset anymore, right? The reason why Southern cities are where they are, the reason why the South is so small town and suburban goes all the way back to our agricultural roots. Shit I learned from Shirley Leckey at UCF in Coburn Hall that no longer exists.
Yeah.
and and thinking about the past in those terms to me has always sort of brought it back to like when I go to Gettysburg or frankly when I go to Macon, Georgia and I stand in Rose Hill Cemetery, which has all of this history, Allman Brother related, including four of them buried there, and all of the stories that are told in that cemetery, as well as Macon's story that gets told by the people in that cemetery, this whole sort of thing. I find it really interesting. Did you find yourself attracted to place? Where were you able to identify that particular part of your like interest? Can you?
I mean, I think once you're, I don't want to say forced because that's so dramatic. I wasn't forced to leave anywhere. I made a choice to leave, to go to school in Orlando. But once you are outside of where you came from, that place-based identity, it forces you to reflect on the locale then and now, right? Like how it was back then, how it is now, and how have you changed the result of being away from it, right? And so I really do think it's that migration to Orlando that has allowed me to develop a deeper understanding and appreciation for where I came from, but also where I am today. And I think just generally that conscious effort of place has permeated, in the ways I think about history generally, right? Historians obviously think about time, right? Because that's our thing. Like that is our signature. We deal with time. Time is
That
what
change over time.
change
Right.
over time is that is what structures and informs our analysis and our whole way of looking at the past, right? And training on it. But um equally important to time is space and time, right? So it's those two elements together, like you said earlier, historical equation, space plus time equals history, right? If we want to put
Hmm.
it in that way.
I like
um
that. I like that.
so yeah, I think that's for me, it's almost like my own personal journey has allowed me to see that through.
Yeah. And you're bringing to mind something I've said a lot over the years, which is the older you get, the more you come to appreciate history. And it is the younger you are, like when you were a kid, when I was a kid in school, I was the history nerd. And everybody's like, why do you like history so much? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I just like it. So it sounds like we have the exact same story. When I started coaching soccer up here in my 30s, and people would say, what do you do? And well, I work in history. Oh my God, I love history. And that was like the first time I ever heard those words in my life said by somebody my age, you know? And I think it's because we have this more longevity. You start thinking about who you are. At the older you get, you start placing yourself in a bigger, wider context. Why am I who I am,
Right.
etc. And it's always funny about home because it really never changes, but you constantly change and are constantly kind of measuring yourself back to that, when I was 18 when I left Stewart and never really looked back at that little tiny town. And I have a complicated relationship with it. I was going to say it sounds like I have a complicated. I do.
Hmm.
Legit. I really do though enjoy the place that was Orlando and was the University of Central Florida, the universe that was surrounding me, that was knowledge, that was thoughtful people, that was a lot of partying and good times, that was my wonderful wife, that hideously ugly brutalist library and those terrible benches in front of the fountain there. But appreciate you, man. This was fantastic, Sebastian. Now that we've done our place thing, I'm going to stop recording one last time. That'll be a nice well